I never thought I'd become the neighborhood's punchline, until the day Karen started plugging her Tesla straight into my solar panels, laughing as if I were her personal power station. Neighbors filmed, the HOA smirked, and I stood there silent. But silence doesn't mean weakness. Because while she drained my grid in arrogance, she had no idea I was preparing a shock that would flip her world upside down. I'll never forget the first time it happened. I had just stepped out onto my driveway to check the solar monitor, a habit I picked up ever since I installed the panels. It was early morning, the sun was just beginning to climb, and the quiet hum of energy flowing into my grid always gave me a sense of pride. That pride quickly curdled into disbelief. There, in my driveway, was Karen's sleek white Tesla, plugged straight into my outdoor port. At first, I thought maybe she had mistaken the outlet for a community charging point. But no, she knew exactly what she was doing. The smug grin on her face as she leaned against the car said it all. She wasn't confused. She was entitled. And to make matters worse, two of our neighbors were walking by with their dogs, pausing long enough to smirk at me, as if they had stumbled on some sort of comedy show. "Guess you're the neighborhood gas station now," one of them chuckled under his breath. Heat burned in my chest, but I stayed silent. I didn't want to give them the satisfaction of seeing me lose my temper. Karen, however, wasn't satisfied with just stealing my power. She had to add insult on top of it. "Oh, don't worry," she called out loud enough for everyone to hear. "You're producing way more than you'll ever need. Think of this as me helping you make use of all that extra energy." The arrogance in her voice made my blood run cold. She wasn't just mocking me, she was mocking the years of hard work I had put in. I wasn't born into money like Karen. Those solar panels represented years of saving, planning, and sacrificing luxuries so I could finally own something sustainable and mine. But in her eyes, it was just free fuel for her luxury car. I wanted to shout, to call her out in front of everyone, but something stopped me. A memory of every other time I had seen her in HOA meetings, surrounded by her little circle, sneering at anyone who dared oppose her. She always carried herself like she was untouchable, like the rules bent to her will. And anyone who challenged her quickly learned that she played dirty. Complaints, citations, fines, anonymous reports. So I stood there, keeping my composure. Quiet dignity against loud arrogance. But inside, the humiliation was unbearable. It wasn't just that she was draining my electricity, it was the way she wanted the world to see me as weak, as someone who couldn't even defend his own property. The worst part was the laughter. Those two neighbors, emboldened by Karen's confidence, laughed as they walked away. I knew word would spread by sunset. By the next HOA meeting, I'd be the story everyone whispered about. How Karen plugged her Tesla into my house like I was her personal charging station, and how I did nothing. For the rest of that morning, I replayed the scene over and over in my head. Every sneer, every chuckle, every ounce of humiliation burned into me. And yet, something in me hardened too. I wasn't just going to be another one of her quiet victims. Not this time. Later that week, the HOA hosted a neighborhood event at the clubhouse, a casual barbecue where everyone showed up to mingle, complain, and brag. I hadn't planned to go, but curiosity got the better of me. And sure enough, the story had already spread. I heard it the moment I walked in. Karen was standing in the center of a small crowd, wine glass in hand, retelling the tale like it was her favorite comedy routine. And there he was, standing there with his jaw on the floor, like he didn't know what was happening. I told him I was helping him out. He should be grateful. Laughter erupted around her. My stomach twisted as I realized she was using me as entertainment, the punchline of her little HOA comedy hour. Even people I thought were decent chuckled along, not daring to be the one to cross her. She noticed me then, standing at the edge of the crowd. Our eyes locked, and I could see the satisfaction in hers. She lifted her glass slightly, like a toast in my direction, before turning back to her circle. The humiliation doubled, but so did my resolve. She thought she had me figured out, that I was just another pushover, too timid to fight back. But that night, as I walked home under the orange glow of the street lamps, I made a silent promise to myself. I would not let her get away with this. Not again. Karen had power now, but power always shifts. And when it did, I wanted to be ready. What she didn't know was that every moment she mocked me, every ounce of arrogance she poured into her little audience, was only sharpening my resolve. Because nothing builds suspense quite like silence. And nothing delivers justice quite like patience. She had no idea her days of leeching off my grid were numbered. The stage was set. She was about to learn that underestimating me was the biggest mistake of her life. People around here saw me as nothing more than the quiet man at the end of the cul-de-sac. I kept to myself, paid my dues, and rarely caused a ripple in the pond of suburban gossip. That's how I preferred it. What they didn't know was the story behind those solar panels Karen loved to laugh about. To most, it was just a shiny row of black glass on my roof, some quirky eco-project by a man with too much time on his hands. But to me, those panels represented years of grinding, of scraping, of living with less while everyone else in the neighborhood flaunted their new SUVs, remodeled kitchens, and annual vacations. While Karen and her circle spent money like water, I was quietly funneling every spare dollar into my dream of energy independence. I took extra jobs, skipped nights out, patched old clothes instead of buying new. There were months when I ate beans and rice 5 nights in a row just to put a little more away. My pride wasn't in the brand names I wore or the car I drove. It was in finally building something that was mine, something that couldn't be taken away. Or so I thought. But there was more behind it than just money. Few people knew that years earlier, I had watched my family lose everything when my father got tangled in a mortgage trap. The bank repossessed our home, and overnight, we were renters in someone else's run-down property. I swore then that I would never again be at the mercy of someone else's rules. Every nail I hammered, every panel I installed on my roof, was a piece of that vow. Karen never knew that. To her, I was just the quiet neighbor who didn't fight back. She had no idea of the sacrifices burned into every kilowatt my panels produced. And yet, she treated my achievement like a joke, like free candy to snatch whenever she pleased. The humiliation didn't stop at that barbecue, either. A few days later, I overheard 2 board members chuckling as they walked past my house. One of them said, "Maybe we should ask him to set up a charging station for the whole community. He seems happy to donate." It stung more than I cared to admit. Every joke, every smirk, chipped away at the dignity I had worked so hard to protect. I wasn't angry just because Karen had stolen from me. I was angry because she was erasing the years of struggle that made my achievement meaningful. And the truth was, I had been carrying more weight than anyone suspected. I was still paying medical bills from a surgery that insurance barely covered. My savings were thin, stretched tight over obligations that could snap with the wrong gust of bad luck. Those solar panels weren't just a luxury, they were my lifeline. A way to keep control, to avoid being buried under utility bills I couldn't afford. But none of that mattered to Karen. To her, I was weak. Powerless. Someone to be mocked publicly so she could feel taller among her circle. And the HOA, which should have stood for fairness, was too scared, or too entertained, to step in. The more I stayed silent, the more she pushed. One afternoon, I came home to find her Tesla parked right in my driveway, cord already plugged in. She didn't even look ashamed. She waved at me like we were sharing some neighborly arrangement. "Don't mind, do you?" she said, all false sweetness, though her eyes sparkled with mischief. "It's just for a little while. These things drain faster than you'd think." Behind her, another neighbor jogged past, shaking his head at me with a smirk. That tiny gesture cut deeper than her words. It said what they all believed, that I was powerless to stop her. But here's what they didn't know, I wasn't powerless. I had knowledge she couldn't imagine. Before I became the quiet man at the end of the street, I had spent years working in electrical engineering. I understood the grid, the flow of current, the delicate balance of voltage in a way Karen never would. I could tell from the way she carelessly plugged in that she had no idea what she was dealing with. I didn't brag about my past, because what good would it do? People like Karen didn't respect quiet expertise. They only respected power they could see and mockery they could weaponize. But silently, I carried that knowledge like a blade in its sheath, hidden and sharp. Each night, as I watched the numbers on my energy monitor dip from her theft, I thought about my father, about the vows I had made, about the humiliation I endured in silence. The tension tightened inside me, wound like a coil under pressure. Karen thought I was ordinary. The HOA thought I was weak. But they were wrong. Every injustice, every snide laugh, every stolen what was writing a story they wouldn't see the end of until it hit them like lightning. And I was already planning how to flip the switch. If Karen's first theft felt like humiliation, what followed was open mockery. She didn't just continue plugging her Tesla into my solar grid, she started performing it, like it was some kind of neighborhood spectacle. One Saturday morning, I stepped outside to water the front plants. There she was, parked in my driveway again, her Tesla cable looped into my port. But this time she had an audience. Two of her friends from the HOA board lounged nearby, sipping coffee as if it were a brunch event. Karen gestured toward me as I froze on the porch. "See," she announced, loud enough for the entire block. "He doesn't mind. He's got enough sunshine to power the whole community." Her friends laughed, one even lifting their phone to snap a picture. I caught the faint click of the camera. I knew instantly what would happen. By evening, that photo would be circulating through the neighborhood group chat, another punchline at my expense. My throat burned with words I wanted to say, but I swallowed them. I refused to give them the drama they wanted. Instead, I walked back inside, each step heavier than the last. But silence didn't protect me. It invited them. At the next HOA meeting, Karen doubled down. She didn't even wait for the agenda to start. Standing confidently at the front, glass of sparkling water in hand, she launched into her tale as if it were the highlight of her week. "Some of us are doing our part for clean energy," she said, her tone dripping with false virtue. "My Tesla runs on sunshine, courtesy of our very generous neighbor here." All eyes turned toward me. Some smirked, others outright laughed. A few leaned close to whisper, not bothering to hide the glances in my direction. I could feel the heat creeping up my neck, not from shame but from the injustice of it. The HOA president gave a polite chuckle, tapping his gavel. All right, let's stay on track." But the damage was already done. My humiliation had been broadcast, sanctioned, stamped into the HOA's memory. Karen had turned me into entertainment. Over the following weeks, it escalated. I would find her Tesla angled in my driveway at odd hours, headlights off, like she was sneaking in just enough to make her theft seem casual. Sometimes she lingered, chatting with passers-by as if my property was her social corner. Other times, she waved at me through the window with that same infuriating grin, daring me to react. Neighbors began to join in the spectacle. I overheard one man say, "Why doesn't he just lock his port? Afraid she'll fine him for that too." The laughter that followed wasn't kind. Another time, I came home to find a group of teens across the street pointing their phones at Karen's car as it charged. "Free energy," one shouted. They burst into laughter, and I realized the humiliation had jumped generations. I was no longer just the butt of HOA gossip, I was becoming a local joke. Each insult chipped away at me, but I didn't respond. I refused to hand them a scene, refused to play the angry neighbor they could paint as unstable. The quieter I stayed, the louder they mocked. And yet, in my silence, something else was happening. People began to wonder. I caught it in the way their whispers trailed off when I passed. in the glances that lingered longer than they should. Curiosity sparked behind their eyes. Why isn't he fighting back? Why doesn't he say something? At another HOA gathering, Karen made sure to sharpen the blade even further. She strutted in late, keys swinging in her hand, calling out across the room. "Hope you don't mind, neighbor. I topped off on your grid again this morning. Smoothest charge yet." The room erupted in laughter. Some clapped. One man muttered, "Classic," shaking his head as if it were the best running gag in town. I didn't flinch. I sat in the back corner, expression unreadable, hands folded. My calm only deepened their amusement. I could feel the stares digging into me, trying to provoke a crack in my facade. But instead of cracks, I offered stone. Quiet. Steady. And the more I refused to react, the more tension brewed. It was as if the whole room leaned forward, waiting for me to snap, or waiting to find out why I hadn't. Karen mistook my silence for weakness. She thought she had me cornered, humiliated beyond repair. What she didn't know was that every laugh, every whispered insult, every stolen watt of power was winding the coil tighter. I had spent years learning the language of electricity, the push and pull of current, the hidden strength in invisible lines. I understood patience. Circuits didn't need to scream to burn. Voltage didn't need to announce itself before it struck. That night, as the meeting adjourned and neighbors trickled into the parking lot, I walked past Karen's Tesla parked near the clubhouse. Its glossy frame reflected the lights above, humming faintly as if mocking me too. She smiled when she saw me, raising her voice one last time so the stragglers could hear. "Thanks for the juice, neighbor. My car runs smoother than ever." Snickers echoed across the lot. I gave no reply, just a measured look, steady and unshaken, before walking on. They thought my silence was surrender. But in truth, it was the calm before the storm. And the storm was already gathering. The night it happened was almost ordinary. The neighborhood was quiet, porch lights glowing against the dark, sprinklers ticking rhythmically in the distance. But in my garage, I stood over the control panel that I had designed myself, my silent weapon. Every line, every switch, every hidden breaker had been built with precision. Years of study, years of sacrifice, all humming quietly at my fingertips. That evening, Karen had gone too far. She hadn't just parked in my driveway again, she had dragged two of her friends along, laughing as they posed in front of her Tesla while it siphoned my power. Their phones flashed as they recorded little videos, mocking me from my own property. "Free power," one of them shouted, as if it were some kind of commercial. Karen grinned at me through the window when she noticed me watching. It was that same look she always gave, smug, untouchable, cruel. But this time, something in me shifted. I walked calmly to the panel and flipped a single switch. What happened next unfolded like a scene ripped from a film. Karen's Tesla jerked violently, headlights flickering like startled eyes. The charging port sparked in a sharp flash of light, not enough to harm but more than enough to terrify. A high-pitched whine filled the driveway as the voltage surged for a fraction of a second, then cut cleanly to nothing. The car went dark. Silent. Karen shrieked, stumbling back in her heels. Her friends gasped, phones tumbling from their hands. For the first time since this torment began, their laughter was gone, ripped away in an instant by the invisible force they thought belonged to them. I stepped out onto the porch, calm as ever. No yelling, no gloating. Just silence as I walked toward the scene, the air thick with static tension. The neighbors across the street peeked through blinds, drawn by the sudden commotion. A few even stepped outside, phones already recording, waiting to capture what came next. Karen's voice cracked as she tried to cover her fear. What did you do?" I didn't answer her question. Instead, I crouched near the Tesla's charging port, inspecting it like a surgeon examining a wound. Then I stood, brushing invisible dust from my hands. "Funny thing about electricity," I said evenly, loud enough for the crowd gathering nearby. It doesn't care who you are. Treat it with arrogance, and it will humble you. The murmurs rippled instantly. The neighbors leaned closer, eyes darting between me and Karen. For months, they had only seen me as the quiet man who took her abuse. Now, standing in front of a car she couldn't even start, I wasn't just a victim anymore. I was in control. Karen's face flushed red, a cocktail of anger and embarrassment. You sabotaged my car," she stammered, her voice shrill. I shook my head slowly. No sabotage, just balance. You've been draining power that doesn't belong to you. Tonight, the system corrected itself. Someone in the crowd laughed nervously, then clapped once, sharply. It wasn't applause yet, but it was enough to shift the energy. The whispers spread like fire. Did you see that spark? He did something. He knows what he's doing. Maybe he's not so powerless after all. Karen tried to regain her composure, brushing her hair back, pretending she wasn't rattled. But the sweat on her forehead told the truth. For the first time, she was on the defensive. I let the silence stretch before speaking again. You thought I was just the quiet neighbor with shiny panels on my roof. But those panels are more than decoration. I designed this system myself. Every circuit, every wire, every breaker. You've been leeching off something you don't even understand. Gasps rippled through the group. It was as though a curtain had lifted, revealing a part of me they had never considered. Not weak, not helpless, just waiting. Karen's friends exchanged uneasy glances, their phones lowered, no longer bold enough to record. The crowd that had once laughed at me now stared wide-eyed, caught between awe and discomfort. And Karen. She tried to speak, but her voice failed her. The arrogance had drained as quickly as her car's battery. I stepped back, calm as stone, and looked directly at her. This is the last time you plug into my life without permission. The silence that followed was electric. No laughter, no whispers, just stunned stillness. The power dynamic had flipped in a single moment, and everyone knew it. The HOA members who had once smirked at my humiliation avoided my eyes now. Neighbors who had chuckled at my expense stood with their mouths half open, unsure whether to clap or retreat. The suspense had broken into something raw: respect, fear, maybe even admiration. Karen finally managed a weak laugh, the sound brittle, false. You'll regret this," she muttered, but the words rang hollow. She wasn't in control anymore. I turned without answering and walked back to my porch. Behind me, the murmurs began to swell again, this time not with laughter but with disbelief. Phones buzzed as the footage spread instantly to group chats. Within hours, everyone would know. The man they thought powerless had brought Karen's arrogance to its knees with nothing more than a flip of a switch. For the first time in months, I wasn't the joke. I was the storm. The driveway felt like a stage after the lights had gone out. Karen stood frozen beside her Tesla, cheeks burning under the glow of porch lamps, her bravado crumbling in front of everyone. The spark that had flashed from the port replayed itself in whispers among the neighbors. Phones were still raised, not to laugh at me this time, but to capture the moment she had finally been humbled. Her friends shifted awkwardly, their arms crossed, their smug grins gone. One of them muttered, "That didn't look safe," but his voice shook, as though he was trying to convince himself more than anyone else. The crowd began to murmur, the kind of hushed talk that carries heavier weight than shouting. I caught snippets. "Did you see the way he handled it? He knows electricity. You can tell." Karen finally pushed the wrong person. For months, I had been the butt of every whispered joke, the quiet man no one took seriously. But now those same voices carried a new edge: curiosity, respect, maybe even caution. Karen's face twisted as she scrambled to regain control of the story. He rigged it," she shouted, pointing a shaking finger at me. "That was dangerous. Illegal. Her words landed flat. No laughter followed. No one rushed to her side. Instead, all eyes drifted back to me, waiting. I didn't raise my voice, didn't need to. Calm carried more weight than anger ever could. My system is designed to protect itself, I said evenly, my voice carrying in the still night air. When someone tries to take what isn't theirs, it reacts. Safely, but firmly. That's not sabotage. That's called boundaries. A ripple of nods passed through the crowd. It was subtle, but I felt it. The current of judgment had shifted, and now it flowed against Karen. Her Tesla sat dead silent, its once glowing charge ring dark. She tapped the screen on her key fob, desperate, but the car didn't respond. Each failed attempt drew more whispers. Some neighbors laughed softly, not at me, but at her. Looks like the sun's not free after all, someone murmured, and a few chuckles followed. Karen's lips tightened. You'll regret this, she hissed, her voice cracking with humiliation. I met her glare without flinching. The only thing I regret, I said calmly, is giving you the benefit of silence for as long as I did. The words hung in the air like a verdict. No one clapped, but the silence that followed was louder than applause. Even her allies from the HOA couldn't meet her eyes. For once, she was alone. Justice didn't come in a roar that night, it came in stillness. In the way people looked at me differently as they drifted away. In the nods of approval, the hushed, good for him, I caught from a neighbor I'd never spoken to. Karen stayed by her car long after the crowd began to scatter, fiddling with her phone, probably calling Tesla support or anyone who could rescue her from the embarrassment. I didn't offer help. Not out of cruelty, but because help is earned, not stolen. Later that week, the aftermath rippled wider than I expected. At the grocery store, a woman from 3 streets over stopped me by the produce aisle. You're the solar guy, right? She asked. Her smile wasn't mocking, it was genuine. Good for you. Someone needed to put her in her place. The HOA's group chat, usually a graveyard of complaints and gossip, lit up with debates. Clips of Karen's panicked face and the Tesla's flickering lights circulated faster than wildfire. I didn't post a word, but the videos spoke louder than I ever could. When the next HOA meeting came, Karen didn't strut in late with her glass of sparkling water. She came early, face stiff, eyes avoiding mine. The room buzzed with tension, but it wasn't directed at me anymore. It was aimed at her. The president cleared his throat and started the agenda, but people whispered behind their hands, glancing toward her, waiting for a spectacle that never came. For once, Karen sat silent. And when a board member offhandedly mentioned personal property rights during discussion, the room shifted. The eyes that once mocked me now nodded in my direction, as though silently acknowledging the lesson had been learned. I didn't gloat. I didn't smirk. I simply sat with folded hands, listening. Justice doesn't need shouting, it's stronger when it's quiet. Karen's power had always been in her ability to control the story, to turn neighbors against neighbors with laughter and shame. But now the story wasn't hers anymore. It was mine. A story of patience, of quiet dignity, and of the moment when arrogance finally met resistance it couldn't laugh off. That night, as I walked home under the same street lamps that once lit my humiliation, I felt lighter. The sting of mockery had faded, replaced by a steady calm. Not victory, something deeper. Balance. For the first time in months, I wasn't the neighborhood's punchline. I was the reminder that even the quietest man can hold the strongest current. And Karen. She learned what every arrogant neighbor eventually does. When you steal power long enough, it finds its way back to you, magnified. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood seemed to breathe differently. Where there had once been snickers and side glances, there was silence, respectful silence. The kind that follows a storm when the air feels cleaner, sharper, more alive. I noticed it first in the smallest ways. The neighbor who used to smirk when he walked his dog past my house now gave me a polite nod. The joggers who once chuckled as they passed Karen's Tesla plugged into my grid crossed to the other side of the street, as if unwilling to trespass on my space. The whispers hadn't stopped, but they had changed. They carried weight, not ridicule. Karen, on the other hand, walked through the community like a shadow of herself. Her strut was gone, her voice quieter at meetings, her gaze often fixed on the ground. For someone who once thrived on being the loudest, it was a transformation more powerful than any punishment I could have delivered. At the next HOA gathering, I arrived quietly, as I always did. But something felt different the moment I walked into the clubhouse. Conversations hushed. Heads turned. For once, the spotlight didn't mock, it acknowledged. People made space for me, offered seats at the front instead of leaving me at the back. It was subtle, but unmistakable, the shift of respect. The president cleared his throat as the meeting began. "Before we start," he said carefully, glancing toward Karen, "I'd like to remind everyone of the importance of respecting personal property." His eyes flicked to me for the briefest moment, and I saw it, the unspoken recognition. The rules Karen once bent like toys now stood firm, reinforced by the quiet man she thought she could humiliate. Karen sat in silence, lips pressed tight, her usual interruptions absent. The crowd's eyes no longer danced around her, no longer sought her approval. They had seen her shaken. They had seen her arrogance falter. And they remembered. Afterward, a neighbor I barely knew approached me in the parking lot. He extended his hand, firm and genuine. "I heard about what you did. Not just the Tesla, but how you handled it. Calm. Controlled. That's impressive." I shook his hand, offering only a nod. I didn't need to boast. Dignity doesn't need a microphone, it speaks through presence. Over time, the ripple spread further. Conversations that once shut me out now paused to include me. Neighbors who once whispered behind my back now lowered their voices when Karen entered the room. The power balance had shifted, and I hadn't lifted a single finger in anger. Karen tried to recover her image, of course. She started with small acts, smiling too wide at the grocery store, waving exaggeratedly at neighbors from her driveway. But the sincerity was gone, and everyone could see it. The queen of the HOA had become the cautionary tale. And me. I kept to myself, as I always had. I tended my garden, monitored my solar grid, walked through the neighborhood with quiet steps. But something lingered in the way people looked at me now. Not pity. Not ridicule. Something closer to respect. And perhaps, just a little fear. There's a peculiar strength in silence. People mistake it for weakness until it reveals its edge. My silence had been mocked, but it had also kept me steady, waiting for the moment to strike. And when it came, it wasn't noise that turned the tide, it was control. One evening, as the sun dipped low and cast long shadows across the cul-de-sac, I stood by my panels, watching the numbers climb. Energy flowed steadily, faithfully, into the grid I had built with my own hands. For the first time in a long while, I felt proud. Not because I had beaten Karen, but because I had proven to myself that dignity, when held long enough, becomes unshakable. A group of kids rode their bikes past, their laughter ringing down the street. One of them pointed to my roof. "That's the solar guy," he said, with a kind of awe I hadn't expected. The others nodded, as if the panels had transformed from some quirky project into a symbol. My symbol. Respect doesn't always come in applause. Sometimes it comes in silence, in the way people hesitate before crossing your boundary, in the way their eyes acknowledge what they once overlooked. Karen learned that night what I had always known. Power doesn't shout. Real power hums quietly, steady and invisible, until the moment it's tested. And then, it reveals itself, not in anger, but in undeniable truth. The community would remember the spark, the silence, the calm that followed. They would remember how the man they underestimated taught them all a lesson about respect. And I would remember the look in Karen's eyes, the shock, the collapse, the realization that her reign of arrogance had ended the moment the current shifted. The HOA still holds its meetings, still debates over fences and lawns and paint colors. But one thing is different now. When I walk into the room, people listen. When I speak, they pause. Not because I demand it, but because respect, once earned, doesn't need to be asked for. Justice had unfolded, not with fines or rules or arguments, but with the quiet revelation that even the smallest current can light up an entire neighborhood. When I look back on it all now, I realize it was never about the stolen electricity. It wasn't about the flickering headlights, the laughter, or even the humiliation I carried for weeks. It was about something deeper, something that every person eventually learns, whether they want to or not. Respect. Karen thought respect came from power you could flaunt, from mockery, from bending rules until they snapped. She believed the HOA's attention, the crowd's laughter, and the shine of her Tesla made her untouchable. For a while, the neighborhood believed it too. I almost believed it myself. But true respect doesn't roar. It doesn't strut or sneer. It doesn't feed on humiliation. Respect is quieter, forged in sacrifice, in patience, in endurance. It grows unseen until the moment it is tested. And when it reveals itself, it leaves no doubt. I had spent years working for something she treated like a toy. Each solar panel on my roof carried with it nights of sacrifice, mornings of worry, and a vow I made long ago that I would never again be powerless. Karen didn't see that. The crowd didn't see that. They saw only the silence I wore like armor. And yet, that silence was my greatest strength. Because silence doesn't mean weakness. It means restraint. It means waiting until the right moment, until the truth itself becomes undeniable. That night, when sparks lit her arrogance for all to see, the silence finally broke. And what filled its place wasn't anger or revenge, it was justice. Justice isn't always a gavel striking wood or a badge flashing in the dark. Sometimes, justice is simply balance being restored. A neighbor learning that power is not free. A community realizing that the quiet man they laughed at was holding the strongest current all along. People often underestimate the underdog. They mistake humility for submission, silence for surrender. But if this story proves anything, it's that the underdog always carries more than anyone imagines. Behind every quiet figure is a story of struggle, a well of endurance, and a strength sharpened in silence. Karen lost more than a charge that night. She lost the illusion that arrogance can shield you forever. And the neighborhood gained more than entertainment. They gained a lesson that will linger long after the whispers fade. Never underestimate anyone. Respect is not about appearances, titles, or cars that gleam in the sun. Respect is about recognizing sacrifice, honoring boundaries, and understanding that dignity cannot be stolen. It can only be ignored until it rises. True power is silent. It hums like the current in a wire, invisible but unstoppable. It doesn't need applause to prove itself. It doesn't need permission to exist. It waits, steady, until arrogance dares to touch it, and then it shows its strength without hesitation. Honor is earned, not through mockery or domination, but through sacrifice. Through the long nights of saving, the quiet years of building, the patience to endure when no one believes in you. That kind of honor doesn't just survive, it prevails. And maybe that's the real lesson Karen never understood. When you spend your life taking from others, eventually the current you stole finds its way back to you. Magnified. Unforgiving. A shock that humbles even the proudest. I never wanted to be the center of attention. I never wanted the spotlight, the whispers, or the videos that spread through the neighborhood. But life has a way of reminding us that dignity, once tested, shines brighter than arrogance ever could. Now, when I walk into HOA meetings, I don't hear laughter. I hear silence. A silence that carries weight, that says, we remember. And in that silence, there is respect. If you take anything from my story, let it be this: never mistake quiet for weak. Never measure worth by appearances. And never forget that the humblest neighbor, the most underestimated soul, may hold a strength that could shake your world when the time comes. Because real power doesn't announce itself. It waits. And when it finally speaks, it leaves no room for doubt. Karen thought she owned the neighborhood with her arrogance. But in the end, she learned what I had always known: respect isn't demanded, it's earned. And once earned, it changes everything.